There is a strange thing about the wall. It is probably the most successful fortification in Westeros. It is 300 miles long, roughly 700 feet high, and for thousands of years, the kingdom south of it have treated it as the line between civilization and everything they are afraid of. And yet, by the time the main story begins, the wall is not really being defended. That sounds like a contradiction, but it is the entire point. The wall did not suddenly become too short. It did not melt down to half its height. Nobody discovered a giant medieval drill that made 700 feet of ice obsolete. The structure stayed almost exactly where it had always been. What disappeared was the institution behind it. The Night's Watch once had more than 10,000 men. It built 19 castles along the wall, and, at its height, manned as many as 17 of them. Castle Black alone once held about 5,000 fighting men. By 298 AC, the entire order had fallen below 1,000. Only 3 castles were still occupied. Castle Black had roughly 600 brothers. The Shadow Tower had around 200. Eastwatch had fewer still. Same wall, same distance, same northern threat, about 90% less organization standing behind it. So the real question is not whether the wall is a good wall. It obviously is. The better question is this: what happens when you build an extraordinary defensive system and then spend centuries quietly removing the people who make that system work? Because the wall was never just a wall. It was a network. 19 strongholds were built along its length. Patrols moved between them. Rangers went north to find threats before those threats reached the ice. Builders maintained stairs, tunnels, winches, weapons, roads, and the wall itself. Stewards moved food, horses, clothing, fuel, and equipment. At the top of the wall were catapults, scorpions, cranes, and trebuchets. At the bottom were gates and tunnels that had to be watched. On the eastern end, Eastwatch maintained ships because the wall stops at the sea, and people are annoyingly capable of owning boats. That is the first thing the giant sheet of ice hides from you. A barrier only works if something notices when somebody tries to cross it. Imagine replacing every guard at an airport with a very impressive fence. The fence could be 30 feet high. It could have spikes. It could be made from dragon bone. If nobody watches the doors, checks the cameras, repairs the locks, or notices someone climbing the back, you do not have security. You have architecture. The wall is the same problem at continental scale. The machinery tells the same story. Some of the wall's catapults and trebuchets had been taken apart for repairs and simply never put back together. Sections froze into the ice. Roads and paths that once connected active positions stopped receiving basic maintenance. The Watch still possessed the physical outline of a military system, but more and more of that system existed in the past tense. That distinction matters. A fortress can look terrifying from a distance and still be operationally dead. A tower with no sentry is scenery. A catapult nobody can crew is furniture. A sealed gate nobody checks is only secure until somebody discovers another route. And once enough small pieces stop working, the giant thing they support can keep looking. Impressive for years after its real capacity has disappeared. When the Night's Watch was large, its castles were not isolated buildings. They were nodes in a detection system. When the Watch shrank, the network did not become smaller in an orderly way. It became full of holes. The Order had built 19 castles, but it never manned more than 17 at once. Even that still created a chain of occupied positions across the wall. By the late 3rd century after Aegon's conquest, only Castle Black, the Shadow Tower, and Eastwatch remained active. 16 strongholds were empty. The tunnels at abandoned castles could be sealed with ice and stone, but an empty castle does not scout. It does not send patrols. It does not notice tracks. It does not maintain the road. It does not see a climbing party 2 miles away and send a raven before sunset. The Watch's own patrols became less frequent as its manpower declined. Even the path along the top of the wall deteriorated between older castles because sections had not been graveled in years. This is not a wall failing. This is a sensor network going offline, one station at a time. And the decline was not just military. The entire support system south of the wall weakened with it. The gift had been granted to support the Watch. Farms, villages, orchards, and taxes were supposed to feed the institution guarding the realm. But as the Watch shrank, fewer men worked its lands. Wildling raids pushed people away from the new gift. Farms and holdfasts emptied. Less population meant less food and less labor, which made the Watch weaker, which made raids easier, which drove away more people. That is a feedback loop. And it is exactly the kind of failure that a 700-foot wall cannot fix. The most revealing example may be the Night Fort. It was the oldest and largest stronghold on the wall, and the Night's Watch abandoned it during the reign of Jaehaerys I, not because an enemy destroyed it, because it had become too expensive to repair, and the Watch no longer had enough men to fill it. That is almost the whole story in miniature. The biggest threat to the wall was not someone breaking the ice. It was the institution deciding, one castle at a time, that it could no longer afford to stand there. But there is an even stranger design choice hidden underneath all of this. The castles of the Night's Watch are barely castles. Castle Black has no defensive walls to the east, west, or south. That is not an accident. The strongholds were built to face north. The Watch was supposed to remain neutral in the Wars of the Seven Kingdoms, so it did not design its bases to defend themselves from armies coming from the south. In other words, the people guarding the most famous wall in the world deliberately lived in forts that could be attacked from behind. Under the original assumptions, that makes sense. The wall is the defense. The kingdoms to the south are the people being defended. If the Night's Watch is politically neutral, there should be no reason to turn Castle Black into a fortress against Winterfell. The problem is that a defensive system is only as good as the assumptions frozen into its design, and those assumptions can be attacked. During Mance Rayder's invasion, the Free Folk did not need to defeat the wall head-on first. A force crossed over the wall and came down on the southern side. Styr and a little over 100 raiders moved toward Castle Black from behind, hoping to seize the nearly undefended stronghold and open the gate for Mance's main host. That plan is beautiful in the worst possible way. The wall can be 700 feet high in front of you. If you get 10 men behind it, the height suddenly becomes somebody else's problem. Castle Black's lack of southern defenses meant the raiders were attacking barracks, towers, stairs, and wooden buildings, rather than a second fortress wall. The Watch managed to stop them, but look at what the episode proves. The Free Folk did not have to destroy the defensive system. They only had to reach the side the system was not designed to fight. And this keeps happening, because the wall is not actually a continuous solution to movement. People climb it. People cross through gates. People slip over when patrols miss them. People go around the eastern end in small boats through the Bay of Seals. Wildling raiders had been doing that for generations, which gives us one of the cleanest examples in the history of the Watch, Raymond Redbeard. In 226 AC, Raymond was king beyond the wall. His host got past the wall and moved south. The Night's Watch did not stop him at the ice. House Stark and House Umber met his army at Long Lake. Raymond was killed there. His invasion ended there, and then the Night's Watch arrived, too late to fight. They were ordered to bury the dead. Their Lord Commander, Jack Musgood, became known afterward as Sleepy Jack. That story is useful because the wall itself did not lose a battle. It was bypassed. The alarm system failed, the response was late, and the backup defense had to come from the north. A giant fortification had become something like a locked front door in a house where nobody hears the window break. And by the opening of a Game of Thrones, the numbers make that problem brutal. Less than 1,000 men are responsible for 300 miles of frontier, but even that number is misleading, because not every brother is a ranger. The Watch also needs builders and stewards. Someone has to cook. Someone has to tend horses. Someone has to repair the wall. Someone has to haul gravel, chop wood, maintain weapons, stock food, send ravens, care for the sick, and keep the machinery working. When Jeor Mormont takes 200 men from Castle Black on the Great Ranging, most of the 400 left behind are builders and stewards. So the effective mobile fighting force is much smaller than the headline number. And then the Fist of the First Men destroys much of the Great Ranging. 300 men had gone north from Castle Black. And the Shadow Tower, only a tiny fraction returned. By the time the Watch chooses its next Lord Commander, fewer than 600 brothers remain available to vote. This is not merely a smaller army. It is institutional collapse happening during an active emergency. The worst part is that Westeros had spent centuries training itself not to notice. Service on the wall was once considered honorable. Knights and younger sons joined voluntarily. The Watch had prestige, land, income, manpower, and political attention. By Robert Baratheon's reign, much of the realm treats it like a distant penal colony. Recruiters pull men from dungeons. The order is increasingly filled with criminals, debtors, political losers, unwanted sons, and the occasional noble who still takes the vows seriously. There is also a recruitment problem hiding inside the manpower problem. The Watch did not simply wake up one morning and discover that 9,000 men had vanished. Its social pipeline changed. In earlier centuries, taking the Black could be honorable. Highborn younger sons, knights, and ambitious commoners could see the Watch as a real military calling. By the late Targaryen and Baratheon eras, much of the South increasingly treated the order as somewhere to send criminals, disgraced men, debtors, and political inconveniences. That changes more than the head count. It changes skills. A frontier system needs experienced officers, engineers, sailors, horsemen, scouts, logisticians, and people willing to spend their entire lives maintaining a threat most of the realm thinks is imaginary. You can fill a barracks with prisoners and still fail to replace a professional institution. And because Aegon's conquest reduced the number of independent wars between Westerosi kingdoms, there were also fewer defeated armies and dispossessed nobles feeding experienced military men into the Watch. The Wall did not just lose bodies, it lost a recruitment culture. The threat in the north did not disappear. The belief in the threat disappeared. That distinction matters because institutions do not collapse when their mission becomes unnecessary. They collapse when the people funding them decide the mission feels unnecessary. And for centuries, the Wall helped create that illusion that worked so well that the danger behind it became a story. The safer the kingdoms felt, the less urgent the Watch seemed. The less urgent the Watch seemed, the fewer men and resources it received. The fewer men it received, the easier it became for raiders to climb, sail around, or slip through the gaps. Success slowly consumed the institution that produced it. Now, there is a very strong argument against everything I have just said. The Wall worked. Not theoretically, actually. For thousands of years, major invasions from the far north repeatedly failed to become permanent conquests of the Seven Kingdoms. When Mance Rayder finally brings an enormous host against the Wall, the direct attack does not simply sweep through Castle Black. The defenders use the height brutally. They drop stones and barrels. They shoot downward. They defend the tunnel. Mance's army cannot casually knock down 700 feet of ice. And when Stannis Baratheon arrives through Eastwatch and attacks the Free Folk from the south, the invasion collapses. So maybe the obvious answer is the correct one. The Wall is an extraordinary defensive structure. Yes, that is exactly the point. If a defensive structure works for centuries and then begins to fail while the structure itself remains largely unchanged, the first place to look is not the ice. It is the organization operating it. The Wall was built as part of a system that assumed occupied castles, regular patrols, functioning roads, ships at Eastwatch, trained rangers, stocked garrisons, and a realm willing to supply new men. Remove those pieces, and the ice does not become weaker. It becomes irrelevant in more places. A 700-foot barrier can stop an army directly beneath it. It cannot stop the climbing party nobody sees. It cannot stop the boat nobody patrols for. It cannot defend Castle Black from the south. It cannot send reinforcements to Long Lake. It cannot recruit replacements. It cannot convince a king in the south that frozen corpses are getting back up. And that is why the Wall is such a good piece of world building. The obvious fantasy object is almost a distraction. Everyone looks at the impossible engineering and asks whether an army could break it. But armies do not need to break systems that have already been hollowed out. They need to find the part nobody is watching. The Night's Watch did not inherit a bad defensive design. It inherited an enormous, expensive, highly specialized machine, and then watched the realm slowly stop paying for the operators. 10,000 men became fewer than 1,000. 17 occupied castles became 3. Regular patrols became gaps. Prestige became punishment. The Wall stayed 700 feet high, and that may be the most believable part of the whole thing. Because great defenses rarely fail at the point where they look strongest. They fail somewhere quieter. A maintenance budget, an empty watchtower, a patrol that never leaves, a message that arrives too late. Jon Snow's response is revealing because he does not propose building a taller wall. He tries to put people back into the empty system. As Lord Commander, he plans to re-garrison abandoned castles. He places men at Icemark and Greyguard. He considers using surrendered free folk to occupy other empty strongholds under Watch officers. That is basically an admission of what the real problem is. Jon has seen the others. He knows the threat is becoming worse, and his answer is not new ice. It is coverage. More occupied positions, more eyes, more local response, more people between one alarm and the next. The most important upgrade to the Wall is a human being standing on it. The Wall never really failed. The Watch behind it did.